As I learned more about our detainee practices, I came to the conclusion that they were contrary to Canada's values, contrary to Canada's interests, contrary to Canada's official policies, and also contrary to international law. That is, they were un-Canadian, counterproductive, and probably illegal. Starting in May 2006, as we in the field became aware of the scope and severity of these problems, we began informing Ottawa about them. We used the means available to us, that is, written reports and verbal briefings, to alert senior officials in both DFATE and the Canadian Forces about the grave deficiencies of our detainee practices and their grave consequences. It was our function, responsibility, and obligation to provide such information and analysis. That was our job. The concerns we expressed, I believe, reflect mainstream views and values in both DFATE and the Canadian Forces. I know that my closest military colleagues in Kandahar were extremely troubled by what we were doing with detainees. We on the ground in Kandahar, civilians and military, informed DFATE and the senior military leadership about the notification problems to the Red Cross, the delays and the inadequate information. We informed them about our very serious concerns about what was happening to detainees after transfer. We informed them about the lack of information being given to NATO. In our annual human rights report at the end of 2006, we informed them about systemic problems of torture in Afghan jails. By March 2007, we were orally warning Ottawa that the NDS tortures people, and if we don't want our detainees tortured, we shouldn't hand them to the NDS. And on April 24th and 25th, 2007, as the detainee issue was becoming a political crisis in Ottawa, the embassy sent 2 reports that offered Ottawa a solution. To protect our detainees from being tortured, we should adopt the British and Dutch approach, that is, take responsibility for our own detainees, monitor them ourselves, and establish a robust, aggressive, and well-resourced monitoring mechanism that would guard our detainees from further risk of abuse. Senior officials in DFATE and the Canadian Forces did not welcome our reports or advice. At first, we were mostly ignored. However, by April 2007, we were receiving written messages from the senior Canadian government coordinator for Afghanistan to the effect that we should be quiet and do what we were told, and also phone messages from the DFATE Assistant Deputy Minister suggesting that in future we should not put things on paper, but instead use the telephone. Starting in May 2007, a new ambassador arrived. Immediately thereafter, the paper trail on detainees was reduced. Written reporting from the field was restricted to a very limited circle of officials, which shrank further over time. And reports on detainees began sometimes to be censored, with crucial information removed. By summer 2007, internal censorship had spread to new areas. For example, we could no longer write that the security situation in Afghanistan was deteriorating, even though everyone knew that it was. In terms of established DFATE practice, all of these steps were extremely irregular. By the end of April 2007, senior officials in Ottawa did accept the embassy's recommendations from April 24th and 25th. On May 3rd, we signed a new MOU with the Afghan government that for the first time gave us the right to monitor. DFATE accepted responsibility for that monitoring. However, the other part of our advice was not implemented. That is, to monitor effectively, we needed new resources, at a minimum 1 full-time officer, to conduct the monitoring, as well as to manage the relationships with the NDS, NATO allies, human rights partners, and other partners. Instead, for the first 5 months of our new detainee regime, monitoring was done by a succession of officers, some of whom were in the field on short visits of only a couple of weeks. There was too little capacity and not enough continuity. The result was that, despite the new MOU, our detainees continued to be tortured after they were transferred. Perhaps I should say some of our detainees continued to be tortured after they were transferred. It was only in October 2007 that DFATE senior leadership finally sent a dedicated monitor to Kandahar. Within weeks, he found incontrovertible evidence of continued torture. An Afghan in NDS custody told him that he had been tortured, showed him the marks on his body, was also able to point to the instrument of torture which had been left under a chair in the corner of the room by his interrogator. Up to that point, we had done what we could to monitor in Kandahar and also once in Kabul the existing pool of detainees, at least those we could locate. Canadian officials interviewed numerous Afghans who gave very credible allegations of torture and in several cases still had marks on their body. But they'd all been tortured before May 3rd when the new MOU came into force. The late October 2007 case was, I believe, the first instance after May 3rd that we became aware of. However, because our monitoring regime was ineffectual, there may well have been other cases. October 2007 was 17 months after the PRT first informed senior officials in the Canadian Forces and DFATE about the very grave dangers facing our detainees after transfer. In other words, for a year and a half after they knew about the very high risk of torture, they continued to order military police in the field to hand our detainees to the NDS. And as far as I know, Canada, even today, continues to transfer detainees to the NDS in Kandahar. In October 2007, I left Afghanistan and started a new job in Washington, D.C. In April 2009, I was subpoenaed by the Military Police Complaints Commission. In response, DFATE, in collaboration with the Department of Justice, took 3 significant steps. First, I made it very difficult for me to access legal counsel. This ongoing problem has still not been resolved. Second, DFATE and the Department of Justice, again working together, blocked my access to my own reports from Afghanistan. I was told, we will decide which of your reports you require, and was given none of them. And third, government lawyers have threatened me under Section 38 of the Canada Evidence Act. This had the effect of placing me in an impossible position. If I refused to cooperate with the MPCC subpoena, I could be jailed for up to 6 months. However, if I did cooperate under Section 38, I could be jailed for up to 5 years. And when this warning was sent, DFATE and the Department of Justice, again acting together, were still withholding approval for legal counsel, depriving me of legal advice and protections. A final section, I hope I'm not taking too long. Thank you. Final section, asking the kind of rhetorical question, even if Afghan detainees were being tortured, why should Canadians care? I think there are 5 compelling reasons. Excuse me. First, our detainees were not what intelligence services would call high-value targets, such as IED bomb makers, al-Qaeda terrorists, or Taliban commanders. High-value targets would be detained under a completely different mechanism that involves special forces and targeted intelligence-driven operations. The Afghans I'm discussing today were picked up by conventional forces during routine military operations and on a basis typically not of intelligence, but suspicion or unproven denunciation. According to a very authoritative source, many of the Afghans we detained had no connection to the insurgency whatsoever. From an intelligence point of view, they had little or no value. Frankly, the NDS did not want them. Some of these Afghans may have been foot soldiers or day fighters, but many were just local people, farmers, truck drivers, tailors, peasants, random human beings in the wrong place at the wrong time. Young men in their fields and villages who were completely innocent but were nevertheless rounded up. In other words, we detained and handed over for severe torture a lot of innocent people. A second reason Canadians should care is that seizing people and rendering them for torture is a very serious violation of international and Canadian law. Complicity in torture is a war crime. It is illegal and prosecutable. Third, Canada has always been a powerful advocate of international law and human rights. That is a keystone of who we are as Canadians and what we have always stood for as a people and nation. If we disregard our core principles and values, we also lose our moral authority abroad. If we are complicit in the torture of Afghans in Kandahar, how can we credibly promote human rights in Tehran or Beijing? Fourth, our actions were counter to our own stated policies. In April 2007, Prime Minister Stephen Harper said publicly that Canadian military officials don't send individuals off to be tortured. That was indeed our policy. But behind the military's wall of secrecy, that, unfortunately, is exactly what we were doing. And finally, even if all the Afghans we detained had been Taliban, it would still have been wrong to have them tortured. The Canadian military is a proud and professional organization, thoroughly trained in the rules of war and the correct treatment of prisoners. I'd like to quote, if I may, the authoritative military manual on counterinsurgency. It says that the abuse of detained persons is immoral, illegal, and unprofessional. Torture and cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment is never a morally permissible option, even if lives depend on gaining information. The methods used by the military must reflect the nation's commitment to human dignity and international humanitarian law. When we look at our U.S. allies who work with us in Kandahar, their top commander, General David Petraeus, lists 10 big ideas of counterinsurgency. One is live your values. He said that whenever we place expediency above our values, we end up regretting it. In a counterinsurgency, when you lose moral legitimacy, you lose the war. Canada's counterinsurgency doctrine makes the same point. Persons not taking part in hostilities, including fighters who have been detained, must be treated humanely. Once local citizens have lost confidence in foreign military forces, their sympathies and support will be transferred to the insurgents. Counterinsurgency is an argument to win the support of the locals. Every action, reaction, or failure to act becomes part of the debate. In Kandahar, Canada needs to convince local people that we are better than the Taliban, that our values are superior, that we will look after their interests and protect them. In my judgment, some of our actions in Kandahar, including complicity in torture, turned some local people against us. Instead of winning hearts and minds, we caused Kandaharis to fear the foreigners. Canada's detainee practices, in my view, alienated us from the population and strengthened the insurgency. Thank you for your attention. Merci.
Well, thank you.